The sun was barely rising over the dusty plains, painting the horizon in pale strokes of gold and crimson. A cold wind swept through the empty cabins of the frontier town, rattling shutters and carrying the faint smell of smoke from the distant chimneys. In one small weathered house at the edge of the settlement, a soft voice trembled through the dim morning light. "My mommy isn't waking up," whispered a little girl. Clutching the ragged edge of a blanket to her chest, her wide eyes, pools of confusion and fear, darted across the room. She didn't notice the footprints outside the door, heavy and deliberate, marking the wooden floor with an almost predatory rhythm. She didn't know that the shadow that had paused at the threshold was the most feared Apache, a man whose name alone made settlers shiver around their campfires. The Apache's gaze was steady, almost unreadable as he watched the girl. There was a strange quiet about him, a stillness that didn't belong to someone who had earned a reputation for terror. He stepped closer, boots creaking against the floorboards, and the little girl flinched. Her small voice barely rose above a whisper. "Mommy?" she asked again, pressing the blanket tighter against her tiny frame. Outside, the town was beginning to stir. Horses neighed in the distance, and the faint clatter of wagons echoed along the dirt streets. But inside the little house, time seemed to slow. The Apache knelt, bringing his shadow closer to hers without making a sound. His long hair, dark as the midnight sky, fell over his shoulders, framing a face that had seen more battles than most men could bear to remember. Every scar and line on his face told a story of survival and sorrow. But now, there was no anger, no violence, only a quiet intensity that made the girl's heartbeat thrum faster. "I don't know what to do," the girl murmured, her voice breaking. Her small hands shook as she reached for the man, sensing somehow that he was different from the others who had walked past her window at night. The Apache's eyes softened, just slightly, and he extended a large, weathered hand. Not to harm, but to offer comfort. "Where is she hurt?" he asked, his voice low, carrying the weight of the desert wind and the grit of countless nights under the stars. The words were calm, measured, and yet they carried a strange authority. The girl hesitated. She had never seen someone like him in her life, someone who could inspire both fear and safety in the same heartbeat. She won't wake up," she said, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. She pointed to the bed where her mother lay pale and still, the sunlight catching on her hair like threads of gold. The Apache studied the woman carefully. There was no sign of life beyond the faint rise and fall of her chest. But there was something unusual in the air, a tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He could feel it, an invisible weight pressing down, a danger that was not immediately visible. The girl shivered. Will she be okay?" she asked, her voice tiny, almost swallowed by the large empty room. The Apache did not answer immediately. He studied the shadows cast by the morning sun, the slight movements in the dust motes, and the way the wind pressed against the thin walls. Years of tracking, hunting, surviving in unforgiving lands had taught him one thing. Danger often came dressed in silence, and not every threat announced itself. For a moment the two of them sat in tense silence. The little girl's breathing was uneven, and the Apache's hand hovered near hers, ready to act. Then, faintly, there was a sound of creak from the floor above, a whisper of movement that didn't belong. The man's eyes narrowed, trained to notice the tiniest detail, the slightest irregularity. His fingers twitched, not in aggression, but in readiness. Something was coming, something that would not wait. The girl clutched the blanket to her chin and stared at him, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Who are you?" she asked. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of innocence and curiosity. He hesitated, then spoke in a tone that was rough but not unkind. "My name is not important right now. What matters is her, your mother. We need to be careful." His words were strange for a man of his reputation. People in the settlement whispered that he could disappear in the desert wind, strike without warning, and leave only fear behind. But now he spoke as if his entire life had been waiting for this moment to protect, rather than destroy. Outside, the wind began to shift. The creak of the floorboards became a rhythm, almost a warning. The Apache's sharp eyes scanned the windows and the door. Noting the faint footprints in the dust outside, the marks of someone who had been watching, he stood slowly, moving toward the door, then glanced back at the girl. "Stay here," he instructed, his voice firm yet gentle. "Do not move." "But," she started, a tremor in her voice. "No," he said, cutting her off, and there was an unspoken power in his tone. The girl froze, understanding instinctively that this was a man who commanded the moment, whose presence alone could shift the balance between danger and safety. He stepped outside, the morning light catching the lines of his face, revealing the depth of his experience. The town seemed deceptively quiet, the kind of silence that warned of storms yet to come. And as he moved, the Apache felt the weight of his reputation pressing down from the whispers of history, the legends of fear, the stories of men who dared not cross his path. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the small life inside, the girl who did not yet know him as the most feared Apache, the one whose presence alone had kept the settlers wary for decades. The girl pressed herself against the corner of the room, eyes following him, heart pounding in a rhythm that echoed the unspoken tension outside. She didn't understand who he was, and she didn't understand why fear seemed to twist into hope in the same breath. But something told her that he could face whatever was coming, that he would not let harm touch her mother. Inside, the mother lay still, and the air seemed heavier, charged with anticipation. The Apache crouched near the doorway, senses alert, watching the empty street, listening to the whisper of the wind. There was a presence out there, something subtle and yet unmistakable. He could feel it in the soil, in the dust, in the faint scent of iron carried by the breeze. It was a warning. He knew that the moment had arrived. When the quiet of the plains would be shattered, the girl's small voice broke through the tension again. He's scary," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "But he looks like he'll help." The Apache turned slightly, acknowledging her words with a nod. There was an odd honesty in that, a recognition that courage sometimes came in the most unexpected forms. He had spent years being hunted in tales, feared for deeds long past, yet here, in this small room with a frightened child, his identity had no bearing. Only action mattered. Only the choice to stand between life and danger. Suddenly, a shadow shifted at the edge of the street. Fleeting, almost invisible, yet unmistakably deliberate. The man's hand went to the hilt of the knife at his belt, and the wind seemed to carry a warning. Something or someone was approaching, and it was not coming for talk. The girl gasped, clutching her blanket tighter, unaware that the man she thought she might. Fear was the only one capable of facing the storm that was about to break. And as the first clear signs of movement appeared in the dusty morning light, the Apache's eyes hardened. A life waited inside the house. A past that could not be erased loomed outside. And between them lay a tension so thick that it could snap at any moment. The little girl didn't understand yet. She didn't know the danger, nor the legend standing at her doorway. All she knew was the uncertainty, the fear, and the hope that this stranger, this most feared Apache, might somehow save the day. The wind whispered through the town once more, carrying with it the scent of iron and the promise of confrontation. The Apache's gaze swept the horizon, every muscle taut, every sense alert. Behind him, the little girl watched, waiting. As the first shadow moved closer, and the story of fear, courage, and unexpected guardianship began to unfold, the shadow moved closer, slipping along the edge of the wooden buildings like a ghost that had learned to walk without a sound. The Apache's dark eyes followed every movement, reading the signs in the dust and in the shifting light. There was something familiar about this presence, something that stirred memories long buried beneath desert winds and blood-stained plains. He gritted his teeth, his jaw tightening as the muscles in his arms coiled like springs. Inside the small house, the little girl pressed herself against the corner, trembling. Her mother's shallow breathing had not changed. She could not understand the weight of fear and history that hung over the man in the doorway, or the unspoken code of survival that guided him with every breath. All she knew was that he felt different from the strangers who had wandered past the windows at night. This man carried an invisible shield around her and her mother, though he had not yet touched them. Long before he had arrived at the settlement, the Apache, whose name was Kayla, had walked lands that stretched far beyond the edges of any map the settlers possessed. He had been raised among the harsh deserts and jagged canyons. Taught to survive when the sun scorched the earth and water ran thin, the stories of his past had become legend, though few could distinguish truth from rumor. Some said he had fought off entire battalions alone. Others whispered that he had vanished for months, leaving townsfolk wondering if he had been taken by the spirits of the land itself. He bore all of that quietly, carrying the weight of it in his eyes. The only part of him that told anything of the storms behind his calm exterior, Cale shifted his stance, one hand brushing against the worn leather of the knife at his belt. He could feel it again, the subtle stir in the air that told him danger was near, though he could not yet see its source clearly. It was not just a human threat. It was calculated, patient, almost alive in its approach. He had encountered such presences before, but never with the stakes like these. A child and a mother rested just behind the doorway, fragile in ways that had no place in the violent stories of his life. The little girl, his name was Leora, had been awake long before the sun rose. She had a natural curiosity, though it was tempered by a cautious fear that seemed to cling to her since her earliest memory. Her mother Soraya had always been her guide, her protector, and the steady heartbeat in her small, complicated world. But now Soraya was still, and the warm security Leora relied on had vanished. She looked at Cale again, studying the lines of his face, the way his gaze swept the room and the street beyond, as if he could see what no one else could. Cale's mind drifted briefly, recalling why he had returned to this land after years of wandering. It was not the town that called him back, nor the settlers who whispered his name in fear. It was the pull of unfinished stories, the threads of past promises that had drawn him to places where danger and fate collided. And now, here he was, standing in the dusty morning light with a child who needed protection and a mother whose life might hang by a thread. The old tales would not save her. Only action would. Outside, the shadow paused, merging briefly with the sun-drenched walls. Cale crouched lower, his breathing steady, heart synced with the rhythm of the approaching threat. His instincts, honed over years of tracking and surviving, detected the faintest trace of movement in the dust, a disturbance almost imperceptible but significant enough to signal intent. Whoever or whatever was coming, it knew how to move without drawing attention, how to wait for the perfect moment. Inside the house, Leora finally found her voice again. Are you going to fight it?" she asked quietly, her small hand gripping the edge of the blanket. Cale did not answer immediately. His mind was already calculating the possibilities, the angles, the unknown variables that could turn the morning quiet into chaos. But he could not let her see hesitation. She needed strength, even if it was only a fragment of what he carried silently in his being. "Yes," said at last, his voice low but firm. "I will fight it. But you must stay here. Do not move, do not speak, and do not let fear control you." Leora nodded, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her fear. She had never been told to obey anyone with such authority before, and yet she felt an odd sense of trust. Something about Cale's presence was not like the other settlers, traders, or strangers who had come and gone. There was a depth to him, a history written in every scar, every line of his face, and it carried a strange assurance. Cale turned his attention back outside. The shadow shifted again, now closer to the corner of the street. His eyes narrowed. Whoever had come this far had courage or desperation. Both could be dangerous. He stepped silently onto the wooden porch, boots barely making a sound against the weathered planks, and scanned the area with meticulous precision. The settlement had its own rhythm. Horses' hooves clopped against wooden walkways, wind rattled the tin roofs, and occasional voices called across the streets. But all of it seemed distant to Cale, who focused solely on the approaching danger. He could feel it in the way the air smelled of metallic temps that did not belong to the horses or the dust. There was a hidden story here, a tension that had waited too long to remain unnoticed. As he watched, Cale remembered the last time he had encountered something similar. It had been years ago, on the outskirts of a canyon where the earth itself had seemed to breathe. A presence had stalked him for days, unseen, but always felt, testing his patience and his skill. In the end, he had survived, but only barely. The lesson had remained with him. The unseen was often the deadliest. The little girl stirred behind him, unable to stay still entirely, but Cale's sharp gaze flicked to her instantly. "Leora," he called softly. "Stay where you are. Watch and remember." There was a weight in his words, a silent promise that no harm would come to her if she obeyed. Time seemed to stretch, quiet stretching into an almost unbearable tension. Then, a faint sound carried over the street, a scraping, almost like claws against wood. Cale's eyes sharpened. The shadow was closer now, deliberately moving toward the house, and it was no ordinary person. He could feel it. There was an unnatural patience in its steps, a precision that suggested planning, not chance. Cale's hand brushed the hilt of his knife again. Every muscle was coiled, every sense alert. He had faced hunters, soldiers, and men who thrived on fear, but something about this approaching presence set his instincts on edge. It was clever, quiet, and patient traits he recognized from experience. Traits that often led to danger if underestimated. Inside, Leora pressed her back against the wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her mother still lay motionless, and every instinct inside her told her something was coming. She wanted to cry, but she held it back, remembering Cale's words. There was something about him, calm certainty, that contrasted with the fear racing through her small body. Cale took a slow, deliberate breath. The town, the wind, the faint sounds of horses in the distance, they all receded into a single focus. The shadow was no longer just outside. It was a presence with intent, testing his patience and calculating his response. Cale's mind flicked through possibilities, imagining outcomes, anticipating movement. Then, as if answering some unspoken challenge, the shadow shifted again, revealing a faint outline against the rising sun. It was taller than any ordinary man, moving with a strange, calculated grace. Cale's pulse quickened, but his face remained calm, unreadable. Inside, Leora watched, her eyes wide and unblinking. She could feel the tension pressing against the walls, the air itself thick with anticipation. She didn't understand what was happening. She understood that the man outside the most feared Apache was her only protection. And somehow, she knew that whatever came next would change everything. The first rays of sun struck the shadow directly, revealing more of its form. Cale's eyes narrowed further. There was an unnatural stillness in its posture, a deliberate patience that suggested a mind trained for control and manipulation. Every instinct in his body screamed that this encounter would not be ordinary. He stepped slightly forward, knife ready, senses sharpened by years of survival in harsh lands. Leora clutched the blanket, heart pounding. She wanted to scream, but she could not. Her world had narrowed to the doorway, the man outside, and the shadow moving closer with a silence that carried more threat than words ever could. The wind shifted again, carrying the faintest metallic scent, and Cale's eyes swept the horizon. He could feel the story forming in the air, the collision of past and present, of fear and courage. Whatever had arrived was not yet revealed fully, but its intent was clear. It would test him. It would test the little girl. It would test the fragile line between life and death that hung over her mother. And in that frozen moment, as the sun rose higher over the dusty plains, Cale knew one thing with certainty. The quiet of the morning was over. The past he had carried, the legend that had haunted the townsfolk, and the life that waited inside the house were about to collide with a force that would challenge everything he had ever known. The shadow lingered at the edge of the street, and Cale could feel it probing, testing his focus, trying to find a weakness. His fingers itched at the knife's hilt, but he didn't move forward yet. Patience was his weapon as much as any blade. Every movement had a purpose, every step measured. And the quiet tension pressing down on the town seemed almost alive inside the house. Leora pressed herself closer to her mother's side. Soraya remained still, her face pale, her chest rising and falling in the faintest rhythm. Leora's mind raced with questions she could not voice. Why wouldn't her mother wake? Why had the strange man come to her door? And most pressing of all, what was that shadow waiting outside? She had never felt fear like this before. A fear that was heavy enough to make her small hands tremble and her heart pound so fast it hurt. Cale's mind flicked back to the journey that had brought him here. Months ago, he had heard whispers of trouble near this settlement, rumors that unsettlers had disappeared, that a sickness or a hidden predator was creeping closer. He had thought it might be nothing, just another story to chill children at night, but instinct, honed over decades of survival, told him otherwise. The moment he sensed danger around Soraya's house, he knew he could not turn away. The shadow moved again, this time closer to the corners of the wooden buildings. Cale noticed how it avoided light, how it seemed to merge with every line of shadow cast by the town's empty streets. Whoever it was, or whatever it was, had patience and cunning that matched his own. And yet there was something familiar, a memory buried in the recesses of his mind, whispering that he had seen this kind of presence before. Under different skies and across distant canyons, Leora's small voice broke the silence. "Will it hurt us?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Cale did not answer immediately. He wanted to speak with truth, not promises he could not keep. He crouched slightly, leaning closer to her, but keeping his attention on the street. "It might," he said finally, his voice low and steady, "but I won't let it. You have to trust me." The girl nodded, though her wide eyes betrayed her fear. She could feel the tension, like a rope tightening around her chest. She wanted to speak again, to ask more questions, but something in Cale's posture warned her that silence was safer. The wind picked up, carrying a faint metallic temps, and Cale stiffened. That smell always meant blood, or danger, or both. Outside, a figure began to emerge from the shadow. It was tall, lean, moving with a purpose that suggested experience and danger. Cale's mind raced through possibilities. A bandit. A scout sent ahead. Or something more sinister. Something that had lingered long enough to study the settlement, waiting for the right moment. Whatever it was, it had the patience of a predator. The kind that learned to wait until its prey made the first mistake. Cale's thoughts flicked back to the past, to the stories that had shaped him. He had been a protector, a tracker, a hunter. He had faced men who sought to destroy him for fear, greed, or revenge. He had survived ambushes in canyons, in deserts, where the sun and sand were just as deadly as any human hand. And yet, nothing had ever carried the same quiet, deliberate menace that this approaching figure now radiated. Leora shivered. She felt the pull of fear and the need for hope in equal measure. Cale's presence gave her a strange sense of safety, but it did not erase the threat looming outside. She remembered the stories her mother used to tell of men who could vanish in the wind, heroes whose courage was measured in acts that few would understand. She realized now that the man at her door was one of those legends. Though he had not yet revealed all of himself, the approaching figure stopped at the edge of the street. And for a moment Cale could see the glint of something sharp, a knife. A tool? It reflected the sunlight, small but deadly. Cale's instincts screamed at him to act, but he held his ground. He had learned long ago that patience could be more dangerous to an enemy than force. Every second the shadow waited, every subtle twitch, was part of a plan Cale had to decipher. Meanwhile, a subplot unfolded in the town itself. Old men whispered in corners of the saloon, watching the streets with suspicion. Mothers clutched children and drew them inside their homes. Traders paused mid-step, sensing unease they could not name. Rumors of Cale's return had reached their ears, stories of the feared Apache whose presence meant both protection and danger. Some hoped he would shield them from whatever was coming, while others feared that his very name might attract the worst of it. Cale glanced at the street once more, noting the angles, the shadows, and the subtle cues hidden in the dust. He had faced ambushes before, yes, but there was something calculated here that set his instincts on edge. Whoever this shadow was, it knew how to manipulate silence, how to make the quiet itself a weapon. And in Cale's experience, that was far more dangerous than any open attack. Inside, Leora could not sit still. She crept a little closer to her mother, pressing her small body against the familiar warmth, though it was dimmed now by Soraya's stillness. Why? Why is she like this? She whispered to herself. Cale's voice broke through the haze of fear. It isn't your fault. Stay close. Stay quiet. His eyes flicked toward the shadow again. A small movement, a step too deliberate, too controlled, and Cale tensed. The shadow had not yet revealed its face, but Cale could feel its attention. The way it measured him, measured the house, measured the vulnerable life inside. It was a predator in its own right, waiting for the exact moment to strike. The tension inside the house thickened. Leora's mind drifted, imagining the world outside as a dangerous place, full of men with knives, wind that could carry secrets, and shadows that moved with intention. Yet there was Cale, steady and silent, a presence that reminded her that courage often came from the most unexpected places. The shadow moved again, this time along the side of the buildings, shifting from sun to shade, calculating each step. Cale adjusted his stance, knife ready, senses alert. He could feel the weight of his reputation pressing down not on him, but on the settlement, on the people who whispered his name in fear. And he knew that whatever happened next, the quiet of the morning would be broken in ways no one yet understood. Inside, the little girl's curiosity fought her fear. She wanted to peek, to see who or what was outside, but she remembered Cale's instructions. Instead, she focused on her mother, willing her to wake, willing the stillness to break. She felt a strange connection to Cale, sensing that he had walked lands filled with danger, that he had survived storms and ambushes, that he had faced shadows like the one now moving outside, and she hoped desperately that his presence meant they could survive this too. Cale's eyes swept the street one final time. The shadow was patient, clever, and deliberate. It had intent, and he could feel it in every calculated movement, every hesitation, every subtle shift in the light. He had survived ambushes, traps, and hidden enemies before, but he had never faced one like this, in such close proximity to someone he had sworn to protect. The wind shifted again, carrying dust and the faint smell of metal. Cale crouched, knife at the ready, his senses sharp as the desert sun climbed higher. He had no illusions about the challenge ahead. Whatever was coming had planned its approach with care, and every instinct told him it would not retreat easily. And yet, he would not falter. Not now, not with the lives inside the house resting on his every decision. For Leora, the tension was almost unbearable. She could feel the shadow moving closer, the uncertainty pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. She wanted to call for help, but she knew Cale would hear her, and she trusted him more than anyone else she had ever known. And in the street beyond the house, the shadow paused, as if sensing the presence of the feared Apache, measuring him, waiting for the exact moment when patience and action would collide. Cale's dark eyes locked on the movement, muscles coiled, every sense alert. The quiet of the morning had ended, and the story that had begun in whispers and fear was about to unfold with a force no one yet understood. The wind had shifted again, carrying dust and the faint scent of iron across the street, and Cale's dark eyes scanned the town with unwavering focus. Every shadow seemed alive, every movement deliberate, and the tension in the air pressed down like the heat of the noon sun. He could feel it, the silent patience of the presence outside. The way it measured him, measured the house, and measured the fragile life inside. Leora's hands were clenched tightly around the edge of the blanket, her small body pressed against her mother's side. Soraya remained still, her breathing shallow, and Leora's heart ached with helplessness. She could feel the danger outside, though she could not see it clearly. She trusted Cale implicitly, but fear had a weight all its own, heavy enough to make her knees shake and her chest tighten. Cale crouched on the porch, knife in hand, every sense alive. He could hear the faintest scrape of a boot against wood, the whisper of movement in the dust, the subtle shift of the wind as it bent around the buildings. Whoever or whatever was out there had planned this carefully. He had survived ambushes before, but this felt different. The quiet intelligence behind each movement suggested not just skill, but calculation and patience. Then faintly, he saw it. A flicker of motion at the corner of the street, a shape that seemed almost human but moved with unnatural precision. Cale's muscles tensed. He had faced enemies who struck blindly, who relied on brute force. But this was something else entirely, a presence that studied, waited, and struck only when certain. Inside. Leora's voice trembled as she whispered to herself, "I wish Mommy would wake. I wish this would end." She pressed closer to Soraya, trying to absorb any warmth or life that might still be there. She didn't fully understand the danger, but she could sense it, could feel it pressing against the walls of the small house like a shadow reaching to swallow everything. Cale's eyes flicked back toward her, and he gave a brief nod, a silent reassurance that he would not let harm come to them. Then he turned his attention back to the street. Every instinct in his body screamed that the next moments would decide everything. The shadow was clever, patient, and precise, but Cale had faced impossible odds before. He had survived storms, ambushes, and death itself on countless plains and deserts. And he would survive this too, for them. The figure moved again, stepping closer, its outline becoming clearer against the rising sun. Cale could see the glint of something sharp in its hand, something meant to threaten or harm. He adjusted his stance, knife ready, eyes locked on the movement. The quiet had ended. The tension had been stretched to its breaking point. And now the first true signs of conflict began to emerge. Leora could not help but press herself closer to her mother, whispering words she did not fully understand. "Please, be okay," she murmured. She felt a strange, fragile hope in Cale's presence, though fear still gripped her like a chain. She did not know what would happen next. She understood that he would face whatever danger approached. Cale's mind raced through possibilities. He had faced attackers before, yes, but never in this context. The lives of the innocent rested on his every decision, and every instinct told him the shadow outside was waiting for a mistake. He could sense the intelligence behind each movement, the patience honed by experience, and the relentless intent that made every step a threat. Then the shadow paused, almost as if it were testing him, measuring his resolve. Cale's eyes narrowed. He could see the faintest twitch, the subtle tension in the figure's stance. Every fiber of his being screamed readiness. The air seemed to hold its breath, the dust frozen in the sunlight. And even the town beyond seemed to pause, waiting for the first spark of action. Inside, Leora felt a sudden surge of courage, though she did not fully understand it. She pressed her hand against Soraya's arm, willing her to wake, willing the stillness to break. She could feel Cale's presence like a shield, a barrier against the threat, and it gave her the smallest flicker of hope. But the shadow outside seemed relentless, storm waiting to strike at the first sign of weakness. Cale shifted slightly, his stance low, ready to move. Every sense was heightened, every instinct alive. He could feel the threat pressing closer, could sense the intent in the way it waited, calculating his next move. He had survived impossible odds before, but this was different. The danger was deliberate, patient, and intelligent, and it would not falter easily. The first sound of movement came a faint scraping against wood, deliberate and slow. Cale's eyes flicked to the corner of the street, where the shadow now revealed more of itself. The figure was taller than any ordinary man, moving with a calculated grace that suggested experience and cunning. Cale's grip on his knife tightened. He had faced enemies like this before, but none had carried the quiet patience that made them nearly invisible until the moment of attack. Leora held her breath. Her small body pressed tight against her mother, her mind racing with questions and fear. She did not fully understand what Cale saw, what he sensed, but she felt it in every pulse of the air. In every subtle change of light and shadow, the world outside the house had become a dangerous place. She clung to Cale's presence like a lifeline. Cale's eyes flicked from the shadow to the interior of the house. Soraya remained still, and he could sense the faint beat of her heart beneath the sheets. The tension was unbearable, thick enough to make every breath feel like a struggle. He could feel the potential for chaos building, the moment when patience and danger would collide in ways that could change everything. Then a sudden gust of wind swept through the street. Carrying dust and the faint metallic scent of blood, Cale stiffened. The shadow had moved with deliberate precision, and now it was closer, its intent undeniable. He could see the outline of the figure, the way it measured the distance, calculated the risk, and waited for the exact moment to strike. Inside, Leora whispered again, this time almost to herself. "Cale, you have to protect us." Her voice trembled, and yet there was determination in it, a fragile courage that had not been there before. She could feel the tension pressing against her like a storm, could sense the danger in the silence, and she clung to the man outside as if he were her only hope. Cale's gaze sharpened. He could feel the collision of past and present, of fear and courage, building toward a moment of truth. Every instinct in his body was screaming readiness. The shadow outside was clever, relentless, and patient, but he had faced impossible odds before. He would not falter. He could not falter. The figure moved again, this time stepping fully into the sunlight, revealing a face partially obscured by the brim of a hat. Cale recognized the intent in the posture, the calculated patience in the movements. This was not a random attack. It was deliberate, methodical, and dangerous. The quiet had ended. The tension had been stretched to its limit, and now the first sparks of confrontation were poised to ignite. Inside, Leora's small hands trembled, but there was a spark in her eyes, a mixture of fear and determination. She pressed closer to her mother, whispering words she hoped would reach her. "Wake up, Mommy, please." Her voice was barely audible, but in the tense silence of the house, it seemed to carry weight. Cale took a slow, deliberate breath. Every muscle was taut, every sense alert. The shadow outside had revealed enough to make its intent clear, but not so much that he could underestimate it. He had survived storms, ambushes, and death itself. And now he would face this challenge with the same focus and precision that had always kept him alive. The wind shifted again, and Cale's eyes scanned the street one last time. The shadow was poised, patient, deliberate. It waited for the perfect moment to strike, and every instinct in Cale's body screamed that moment was near. Inside the house, Leora pressed herself closer to Soraya, holding on to the smallest thread of hope that the man outside the most feared. Apache would not let the danger touch them. And in that frozen moment, as the sun climbed higher over the dusty town, the air thick with tension and anticipation, the story of fear, courage, and survival reached its peak. Every movement, every breath, every glance carried the weight of what was about to happen. The calm before the storm had ended. The moment of confrontation, of choice and action, was poised to arrive. And the outcome hung in the balance, waiting to unfold in the next heartbeat. The shadow lunged suddenly, breaking the silence of the morning with a movement so fast it could have been mistaken for the wind. Cale reacted instantly, his knife flashing in the sunlight as he met the attack with precision, honed by years in the unforgiving desert and jagged canyons. The figure froze for a heartbeat, surprised by the swiftness and control of the Apache. Before retreating just enough to regroup, Leora pressed herself closer to her mother, her small hands clutching the blanket so tightly that the fabric strained under her grip. Her breath came in uneven gasps, but she did not cry. She could feel the force of Cale's presence, the calm that belied the intensity of the battle outside. In that moment, she understood what fear and courage truly were: the ability to hold steady even when the world seemed ready to collapse. The shadow moved again, circling the house, seeking a weakness. Cale followed every motion, anticipating each step, reading the angles of light and shade. The town itself seemed frozen in suspense, as if the streets and buildings were holding their collective breath. Cale's senses, sharpened by a life spent surviving ambushes and facing danger, detected the subtle shift in the figure's posture, the change in weight, the tension in the shoulders. The shadow was skilled, but it had underestimated the resolve of the most feared Apache. Inside, Soraya stirred faintly. Her eyelids fluttered, and a soft groan escaped her lips. Leora gasped and pressed a hand against her mother's face. "Mommy? Mommy? Are you awake?" The color returned slowly to Soraya's cheeks as her eyes opened, revealing a mixture of confusion and relief. She looked at Cale, then at her daughter, and understanding dawned in her expression. Somehow, through fear and danger, the man outside had protected them. Cale did not let the moment of relief distract him. The shadow had regrouped, circling back toward the street. But now, Cale's presence had become more than just defensive. He had seen the pattern of the movements, the hesitation, and the rhythm. With a sudden, precise strike, he forced the figure to stumble back, unbalancing the momentum that had carried it so far. The shadow faltered, and for the first time, Cale could see a hint of recognition or fear in its stance. The figure fell to the ground, the knife or tool it carried sliding across the dust with a metallic clang. Cale did not advance immediately. He waited, watching the defeated shadow struggle to rise, to regain control, knowing that patience had carried him this far, and that overconfidence could undo everything. Slowly, deliberately, the figure,